They whispered that Cairo's streets were filthy with sin, so the man who named himself Al-Quddus took the shoes from every woman's foot and chained half the empire to its own doorways, praising God as bare flesh bled upon the stone. In the sweltering heat of the year of our Lord 1004, the great city of Cairo lay shimmering like a mirage of gold and dust beneath the unforgiving Egyptian sun, a jewel of the Fatimid Empire that seemed destined to outshine the stars themselves. Yet, beneath the veneer of alabaster palaces and the rhythmic chanting of the faithful, a rot had begun to fester in the very heart of the citadel, a spiritual gangrene that would soon turn the Nile red with the blood of the innocent. At the center of this gathering darkness sat the Caliph al-Hakim by Amr Allah, a sovereign who had ascended the throne as a mere child of 11 years, but who had now grown into a man possessed by a hunger not for land or gold, but for the terrifying absolute of divinity itself. He was a creature of striking and unsettling contradictions, with eyes as blue as the deep desert sky that seemed to pierce through the flesh of men to judge the trembling souls beneath, and a temperament that shifted like the treacherous sands of the Sahara. The city whispered that the Caliph walked the streets at night, not as a protector, but as a phantom, observing the sins of his subjects with a silence that was louder than the call to prayer. It was in these long, suffocating nights of introspection that a blasphemous idea took root in his fevered mind, a conviction that he was not merely the deputy of God on earth, but the very vessel of the divine name known as Al-Quddus, the most holy, the pure, the one entirely free from imperfection. To the common man, Al-Quddus was a title of comfort, a reminder of the Creator's flawlessness, but in the hands of a mad autocrat, it became a weapon of mass purgation. Al-Hakim looked out from his high balconies upon the bustling, sweating, living city, with its barking dogs, its laughing women, its wine drinkers, and its noise, and he saw not life, but filth. He saw contamination. If he was to be the manifestation of the Pure One, then the world around him had to be scrubbed clean until it reflected his own delusion of perfection. The scholars in the House of Wisdom, trembling over their parchment scrolls, noticed the shift first. The Caliph's decrees began to lose the logic of governance and took on the erratic rhythm of a fever dream. He demanded an impossible order, a celestial silence to descend upon a city of thousands. The air in the court grew heavy with unspoken dread, for the courtiers realized that to serve a man who believes himself to be the flawless Al-Quddus is to walk upon the edge of a razor, where the slightest human error is treated as a cosmic insult. The sun set red over the Macadam hills, casting long, bloody shadows that seemed to reach out and strangle the light, a grim omen of the terror that was to come. The people went about their trade in the souks, haggling over spices and silks, unaware that their ruler was no longer looking at them as subjects to be governed, but as stains to be removed. The transformation had begun, not with a roar of thunder, but with the quiet, scratching sound of a quill on parchment, signing the first of many edicts that would peel away the sanity of the empire layer by layer. The Golden City held its breath, waiting for the dawn, but for Cairo, the true night was only just beginning, and the man who called himself the Pure was preparing to wash the cobblestones in a baptism of horror that would be remembered for 1,000 years. The descent into madness did not begin with the slaughter of men, but with the extermination of the beasts, for in the twisted theology of the Caliph, the path to becoming the living embodiment of Al-Quddus required a silence so profound that it mimicked the vacuum of the heavens. Cairo, in the year 1004, was a city of cacophony, a vibrant, screaming tapestry of life where the braying of donkeys, the shouting of merchants, and the ceaseless barking of the city's dogs wove together into the chaotic song of existence. To any other ruler, this was the sound of a thriving metropolis, the heartbeat of the empire, but to Al-Hakim, whose ears were attuned only to the frequency of his own imagined divinity, this noise was a pestilence. He sat in the high quietude of his palace, his skin crawling at the impurity of it all, convinced that the barking of a dog was not merely an animal instinct, but a direct insult to the sanctity of the night, a blemish upon the holy silence that the Pure One demanded. The decree that went forth was so sudden and so absolute that the scribes who wrote it hesitated, their quills hovering over the parchment in disbelief, yet they dared not question the man who now claimed to see what mere mortals could not. The order was simple, brutal, and without exception. Every dog in Cairo, from the fiercest guard beast to the smallest cur scavenging in the gutters, was to be put to the sword. The soldiers of the Caliph, hardened men of the sword who had faced armies in the field, now found themselves the executioners of a war against nature itself. They swept through the winding streets like a scythe through wheat, their torches casting long, flickering shadows against the limestone walls, hunting down creatures that had known these alleys as their home for generations. The city, usually asleep under the protective gaze of the moon, was awakened by a chorus of yelping and the wet, heavy thud of steel striking flesh. It was a massacre of industrial proportions, a grim and bloody task that stained the cobblestones and filled the gutters with a thick, copper-smelling sludge that refused to wash away with the morning dew. The historians record that over 30,000 animals were slaughtered in those weeks of fury, their carcasses piled high in the desert beyond the city gates like grim monuments to the caliph's obsession with hygiene. The stench of death wafted back into the city, a paradoxical rot created by a man seeking absolute purity, choking the air with the very corruption he sought to eradicate. Yet, as the last dog fell and the final whimper was extinguished, a terrifying transformation took hold of the Golden City. The nights, once alive with the reassuring sounds of life, fell into a deep, unnatural coma. It was a silence so heavy, so oppressive, that it felt like a physical weight pressing down upon the chests of the citizens. The people of Cairo lay in their beds, eyes wide open in the dark, straining to hear a sound that was no longer there, terrified by the realization that their ruler had the power to edit the very soundscape of their reality. They understood then, with a cold dread settling in their stomachs, that this was not merely about dogs. It was a demonstration of absolute dominion. If the caliph could command the extermination of 30,000 living beings simply because their voices offended his delicate sensibilities, what then was the value of a human life? The silence of the dogs was merely the prelude, the opening note in a symphony of suppression that would soon turn its attention to the two-legged inhabitants of the city. Al-Hakim rode through the now silent streets on his grey donkey, observing the void he had created, and where his subjects saw a graveyard, he saw a temple swept clean, a blank canvas upon which he could project his own terrible shadow. The attribute of Al-Quddus, the spotless, had been invoked not to elevate the spirit, but to sanitize the world of its messy, noisy vitality, leaving behind a husk of a city that held its breath in anticipation of the next horror. The fear was palpable, a living thing that stalked the emptiness where the dogs used to roam, and in that terrible quiet, the people of Cairo began to understand that purity, in the hands of a tyrant, is the most dangerous weapon of all. With the barking of the beasts silenced and the blood of 30,000 curs drying into the dusty pores of the city, one might have presumed that the caliph's thirst for a consecrated silence was finally slaked, yet the madness of Al-Hakim by Amr Allah was a fire that consumed all the oxygen in the room, only to demand more fuel lest it flicker and die. The silence of the dogs had merely cleared the stage for a far more grotesque act of purification, for as the caliph gazed down from the gilded heights of his citadel, his eyes, burning with the icy fever of the self-proclaimed Al-Quddus, fell upon the women of Cairo, and in them, he saw not mothers, daughters, or wives, but the living, breathing architecture of sin itself. To a mind that has convinced itself of its own absolute divinity, the very existence of desire is a blasphemy, an impurity that stains the white cloth of the soul, and Al-Hakim reasoned with a terrifying, jagged logic that if he were to make Cairo a reflection of heaven, he must excise the root of all earthly temptation. He did not see citizens, he saw agents of chaos, walking fitna that disturbed the spiritual equilibrium of his domain. Thus, in the year 1005, a decree was issued that would strangle the domestic life of the empire for 7 long and agonizing years, a law so bizarre and cruel that it stands as a singular monument to the ingenuity of tyranny. The caliph did not merely command women to stay indoors, for he knew that the will of humanity is fluid and prone to disobedience. Instead, he attacked the very means of their mobility. He summoned the guild of shoemakers, the cobblers who sat hunched over their lasts in the smell of tanned leather and beeswax, and delivered unto them an edict that carried the weight of death. From this day forth, no boot, no slipper, no sandal, and no shoe of any kind was to be crafted for the foot of a woman. It was a masterstroke of logistical malice. By stripping the women of footwear, he turned the sharp, sun-baked stones of the city streets into an impassable ocean of pain, effectively placing every female in the empire under house arrest without the need for a single chain or shackle. The markets, once vibrant with the rustle of silk and the haggling voices of matrons, were suddenly sheared of half their population. The public baths, the hammams where women gathered to wash and speak freely away from the ears of men, were boarded up and fell into ruin, their steam vents cold and their tiles cracking in the dry heat. A great and terrible hush descended upon the domestic quarters, for the women were now prisoners in their own homes, trapped behind the intricate wooden lattice of the mashrabiyah windows, looking out at a world they were forbidden to touch. The psychological toll of this confinement was a rot that spread slowly and unseen, like damp in a cellar. For 7 years, the sun did not touch the skin of a woman in Cairo. They became pale, ghostly figures drifting through the twilight of their chambers, their muscles atrophying from lack of use, their minds fraying in the isolation. It was a purge of the visible female form, a erasure so complete that a traveler arriving in Cairo during those dark years would have thought the city inhabited solely by a race of men, reproducing by some asexual sorcery. But the horror was not merely in the boredom or the confinement, it was in the quiet, desperate tragedies that unfolded behind closed doors. Widows who had no husbands to fetch them food were left to starve in the gloom, for to step outside barefoot was to invite the wrath of the religious police, the mutasib, who patrolled the streets with whips, eager to punish any violation of the caliph's purity. Stories were whispered, only whispered, for the walls had ears, of women who died in childbirth because no midwife could travel to them, or of mothers who watched their children waste away because they could not go to the market to barter for bread. The logic of Al-Quddus, the Pure One, had created a city of festering misery, where the purity was nothing more than the sterilization of life itself. The caliph, in his deepening delusion, would ride through the souks on his grey donkey, observing the sea of male faces, the utter absence of the fairer sex, and believe he had achieved a spiritual triumph. He saw the absence of women not as a tragedy, but as a cleansing, a removal of the clutter that distracted men from the worship of him. He had turned Cairo into a vast, open-air monastery against its will, enforced by the threat of the sword and the denial of leather soles. The shoemakers, terrified for their lives, turned away weeping women who begged for coverings for their bleeding feet, for the spies of Al-Hakim were everywhere, and to stitch a woman's shoe was to stitch one's own shroud. The absurdity of the decree was matched only by the ferocity of its enforcement. For 7 years, the cycle of the seasons passed, and the women of Egypt withered like flowers kept in a dark box, their existence acknowledged only as a theoretical impurity to be contained. The caliph had sought to emulate the attribute of God who is free from need and passion, but in doing so, he had succumbed to the most human and darkest of failings, the desire to control that which he could not understand. As the years dragged on, the city began to feel less like a capital of an empire and more like a waiting room for the grave, inhabited by men who walked with their heads down, terrified that their own footsteps might offend the ears of the man who had stolen the name of God. The purity of the streets was the purity of a picked bone, white and clean and utterly dead, and high above it all, Al-Hakim sat in his citadel, listening to the silence he had manufactured, unaware that the pressure building behind the walls of those silent houses was a force that no decree, however divine, could contain forever. The silence of the dogs had been achieved, and the invisibility of the women had been enforced, yet in the suffocating stillness of the year of our Lord 1017, the Caliph al-Hakim by Amr Allah found that the quietude of the physical world was not enough to quell the roaring tempest within his own soul. He had purified the streets of beasts and the markets of temptation, but the ultimate barrier to his ascension remained the persistent, nagging worship of an unseen deity, a celestial rival whose name was chanted from the minarets 5 times a day, reminding the caliph that he was but a man made of clay and blood. This realization festered in his mind like a gangrenous wound, turning the attribute of Al-Quddus, the absolute purity, into a mirror that reflected only his own face. It was no longer sufficient to be the commander of the faithful, the deputy of God on earth. The madness that had taken root in his childhood now blossomed into a terrifying flower of heresy. He began to believe, with the cold and unshakable certainty of a stone, that the divine spark did not merely reside within him, but that he was the very incubation of the Godhead itself, the final and perfect manifestation of the Creator walking amongst the created. The pivot from tyranny to blasphemy was not sudden, but crept upon the city like the twilight, a gradual darkening of the spiritual horizon until the faithful looked up and realized the stars had gone out. It began in the innermost circles of the palace, where the air was thick with the smoke of frankincense and the whispers of sycophants who saw in the caliph's delusions a ladder to their own power. Men like Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Durazi, a sorcerer of words and a weaver of lies, poured poison into the caliph's ear, telling him that his erratic whims were not madness, but the ineffable logic of the divine, incomprehensible to the small minds of mortals. Flattered and emboldened, Al-Hakim prepared to commit the ultimate theft. He would steal the prayers of the people. He summoned the highest ulama, the scholars of the law, and the judges of the religious courts to the great hall of the Golden Palace, a chamber of marble and gold that was designed to make men feel like insects. They came with trembling knees and dried mouths, old men who had spent their lives studying the Quran, sensing that a storm was about to break that would test the very foundations of their faith. The caliph sat upon his throne not in the robes of a king, but in simple wool, a terrifying affectation of humility that belied the monumental arrogance of his intent. He looked upon the gathered wise men with those piercing, terrible blue eyes and delivered a proclamation that froze the blood in their veins. He declared that the era of Islam was over, that the revelation given to the Prophet was but a prelude, a mere shadow of the truth that was now standing before them. He announced that he, Al-Hakim, was the living Al-Quddus, the Word made flesh, and that the time had come for the veil to be lifted. The gasp that went through the hall was strangled in the throats of the scholars before it could be borne, for the caliph's Nubian guards stood along the walls like statues of obsidian, their hands resting upon the hilts of their scimitars. The order was given, the scribes were to take their reeds and their inkpots and rewrite the history of salvation. The name of the caliph was to be elevated above the name of the Almighty in the Friday sermons. No longer were the faithful to bow towards the Kaaba in Mecca, that ancient black stone in the desert, they were to bow towards the caliph himself, or towards the Makadam hills where he took his nightly vigils. To refuse was not merely treason, it was, in the twisted logic of the new regime, an act of atheism, a denial of the God who stood right in front of them. The scribes, men whose hands were stained with the ink of holy verses, wept silently as they were forced to commit this abomination to paper. They felt the weight of eternal damnation pressing upon their shoulders, a fear far greater than the fear of the sword, yet the survival instinct is a cruel master, and the pens began to scratch across the parchment, recording the heresy in elegant, flowing calligraphy. The horror of this transformation rippled out from the palace and into the mosques of Cairo. Imagine, if you can, the scene in the mosque of Amr ibn al-As on the following Friday, the holiest day of the week. The sun beat down upon the courtyard where thousands of men were gathered, shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the khutbah, the sermon that would guide their souls. The imam ascended the wooden steps of the minbar, his face the color of ash, his hands shaking so violently that he had to grip the railing to keep from falling. He looked out at the sea of expectant faces, and then at the soldiers stationed at every exit, their eyes watchful and cold. He knew that to speak the traditional prayers was to sign his own death warrant, but to speak the caliph's new liturgy was to sell his soul to the devil. With a voice that cracked and wavered, he began the recitation, but instead of praising the Lord of the worlds, he began to praise the caliph as the manifestation of the divine intellect, the pure one who judges the living and the dead. A collective shudder went through the congregation, a physical recoil as if they had been struck. Men looked at one another with wide, terrified eyes, unable to comprehend the blasphemy that was being poured into their ears. Some wept openly, others fainted from the sheer psychological stress of the moment. They were being held hostage in the house of God, forced to participate in a ritual of idolatry that went against every fiber of their being. And yet, they bowed. They pressed their foreheads to the prayer mats, not in submission to the Almighty, but in submission to the terror of the state. The caliph had achieved the impossible, he had broken the spiritual spine of the city. He walked the streets now with a new and terrifying aura, no longer just a tyrant, but a living idol. His followers, the fanatic Darazian, began to roam the city, proclaiming that the caliph did not eat, sleep, or defecate, that he was composed of pure light and that his actions, no matter how cruel or contradictory, were the perfect will of the cosmos. They whispered that the burning of the city or the starvation of the people was a holy mystery, a test of faith for the believers. The atmosphere in Cairo became suffocating, a thick blanket of paranoia and cognitive dissonance. To survive, the people had to split their minds in two, the outer self that bowed and chanted the name of Al-Hakim, and the inner self that screamed in silence to the true God for deliverance. The Caliph, intoxicated by this total submission, pushed further. He banned the pilgrimage to Mecca, declaring it a superstition of the past. Why travel across the burning sands to circle an empty house when the master of the house was here in Cairo? He commanded that the fast of Ramadan be broken or kept according to his astronomical calculations, untethered from the sighting of the moon, severing the community from the rest of the Islamic world. He was isolating his people, creating a hermetically sealed universe where he was the only sun and the only moon. The psychological toll on the populace was catastrophic. Madness began to spread among the common people, a reflection of the madness of their ruler. Men were seen talking to walls, or walking into the Nile to drown themselves, unable to reconcile the reality of their faith with the reality of their existence. The markets, already quieted by the absence of women and dogs, now took on the hushed, fearful tone of a funeral parlor. Transactions were conducted in whispers, eyes darting to the shadows, for who knew if the beggar in the corner was a spy for the God King? The Caliph's obsession with Al-Quddus had reached its grotesque climax. He had sought to become the pure one, but he had only succeeded in becoming a monster of absolute impurity, a smudge upon the history of the faith that would take centuries to wipe clean. He stood upon the balcony of his palace, looking down at the city he had lobotomized, believing that the silence he heard was the silence of reverence, when in truth, it was the silence of a people holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable crack in the facade, the moment when the man who played God would bleed like the mortal he truly was. But for now, in the year 1017, the sun set on a city where God was dead, and a madman sat upon his throne, and the only prayer that rose from the lips of the faithful was a silent, desperate plea for the end of the world. The breaking point of the human spirit is a fragile thing, often snapping not under the weight of the sword, but under the unbearable lightness of mockery, and so it was in the year of our Lord 1020 that the people of Egypt, pushed beyond the brink of sanity by a ruler who claimed the throne of the Almighty, finally dared to speak back to the heavens. It began not with a roar of rebellion, but with the rustle of paper, a silent insurrection born in the shadows of the mosques that Al-Hakim had sought to corrupt. The citizens, their hearts hardened by years of silence, starvation, and blasphemy, began to leave unsigned notes upon the pulpits and the prayer rugs, crude effigies made of rags and straw that mocked the self-proclaimed deity, holding scrolls that detailed his sexual perversions and the illegitimacy of his lineage. They called him the Dajjal, the deceiver, the Antichrist who walks with the limp of the damned. When the Caliph rode out on his grey donkey, expecting the prostration of his subjects, he instead found these cards of insult fluttering in the wind like dead leaves, 1,000 paper cuts against the ego of a man who believed himself to be the universe. The rage that consumed Al-Hakim was not the anger of a king, but the wrath of a scorned god. In his eyes, the city of Fustat, the bustling, ancient metropolis that lay just south of his royal enclosure of Cairo, had proven itself unworthy of salvation. It was a hive of ingratitude, a cesspit of disbelief that refused to accept the light he offered. If the people would not be purified by his laws, by his silence, or by his theology, then they would be purified by the only element left to the divine arsenal, the cleansing, sterilizing, absolute power of fire. He summoned the commanders of his Sudanese guard, the Abid al-Shira, a terrifying regiment of slave soldiers recruited from the deep interior of Africa, men who owed allegiance to no tribe or family in Egypt, but only to the voice of their master. They were the obsidian hammer of his will, estranged from the populace they policed, and he unleashed them with a command that was as simple as it was apocalyptic: burn it. He did not say, subdue it, or punish it, he ordered the erasure of the city. It was a decree of scorched earth enacted upon his own capital. The guards descended upon Fustat like a plague of locusts made of iron and hate, carrying not just swords, but clay pots filled with naphtha and torches soaked in pitch. They moved with the grim efficiency of executioners, knowing that the Pure One watched from the heights. The first fires were lit in the tightly packed merchant quarters, where the buildings were tall, wooden lattice structures that leaned across narrow alleys to kiss one another. The architecture of Fustat, designed to provide shade and cool the air, now became a perfectly constructed furnace. The dry timber, seasoned by decades of the relentless Egyptian sun, caught the spark with a voracious hunger. Within the span of an hour, the southern skyline was no longer blue or gold, but a churning, violently rotating pillar of black smoke that blotted out the sun, turning the day into a premature and hellish twilight. The panic that seized the population was primal. Mothers clutched their infants to their breasts, running blindly through streets that had transformed into tunnels of flame. The heat was so intense that it sucked the breath from the lungs before the fire could even touch the skin. But this was not merely a tragedy of nature, it was a massacre of intent. As the citizens fled their burning homes, coughing up soot and screaming for mercy, they were met at the intersections by the waiting lines of the Sudanese guards. The soldiers, intoxicated by the license to kill and the frenzy of the destruction, cut down the fleeing refugees where they stood. They laughed as they tossed torches into the crowded mosques where the elderly had gathered to pray for deliverance. The sanctity of the holy places meant nothing to the angels of the new God. They saw the mosques not as houses of prayer, but as ovens for the non-believers. The streets ran with a slurry of blood and ash, a black paste that coated the sandals of the killers. The wealth of Fustat, the accumulated treasures of centuries of trade, silks from China, spices from India, gold from Nubia, all of it fed the conflagration, the material desires of the world literally melting away in the face of the Caliph's judgment. However, the Caliph had miscalculated the ferocity of a people with nothing left to lose. The Turkish and Berber troops of the regular army, the Ghilman and the Maghariba, who lived among the people of Fustat and had intermarried with its families, looked upon the slaughter of their neighbors and the burning of their own homes, and their loyalty to the God-King snapped. They realized that this was not governance, it was suicide. Drawing their scimitars, they turned upon the Caliph's Sudanese guards. The city of Fustat became the stage for a vicious, three-way civil war fought inside a burning cage. It was a scene from the depths of Jahannam, warriors in chainmail clashing amidst falling beams of burning timber, the clang of steel ringing out over the roar of the firestorm. The Turkish cavalry charged through the smoke, trampling the bodies of the dead to get to the arsonists, while the Sudanese infantry fought back with the desperation of men who knew there was no retreat. The streets became choke points of carnage, piled high with the corpses of soldiers and civilians alike, all baking in the heat of the inferno. For 3 days and 3 nights, the battle raged. The sun rose and set, but no one could tell the difference, for the light of the fire was brighter than the day, and the smoke was darker than the night. The Nile itself seemed to reflect the madness, its waters glowing a sullen, bloody red as the reflection of the burning city danced upon the waves, as if the river were bleeding into the sea. And where was the architect of this Armageddon? Where was the man who claimed the name of the compassionate? Al-Hakim by Amr Allah sat upon the high ridge of the Muqaddam Hills, the rocky spine that overlooks the city from the east. He sat atop his observatory, wrapped in his white wool cloak, watching the destruction of his capital with the detached curiosity of a child watching an anthill succumb to a magnifying glass. The historians recount a chilling detail that reveals the absolute depth of his dissociation, as the screams of thousands rose up from the valley below, a collective wail of agony that must have been audible even at that height, and as the smoke stung his eyes, he turned to his terrified courtiers and asked, with a voice devoid of all emotion, "Who ordered this?" When they stared at him in mute horror, too afraid to answer, he smiled a beatific, vacant smile and murmured that the red glow on the horizon was beautiful. He claimed that the people were lighting torches to celebrate his divinity, to honor the Pure One with a festival of light. He rewrote the reality unfolding before his eyes in real time, twisting the massacre into a liturgy of worship. He sent down donkeys laden with bread and dates to the burning city, a grotesque gesture of charity, commanding his heralds to shout, "The Caliph provides for you," even as his other hand commanded the soldiers to thrust the citizens back into the flames. It was the ultimate gaslighting, a psychological torture that hurt more than the burns. He was feeding the people he was incinerating, playing the role of the benevolent provider while simultaneously acting as the angel of death. By the fourth day, the city of Fustat was no longer a city. It was a blackened, smoldering skeleton, a graveyard of masonry and bone. The fire had burned itself out not because of any mercy from the heavens, but simply because there was nothing left to consume. Half of the metropolis lay in ruins. The narrow alleys were choked with rubble and the charred remains of the dead. The stench was overpowering, a sickly, sweet smell of roasted flesh and stagnant smoke that hung over the Nile Valley like a shroud. The Sudanese guards, beaten back by the fury of the Turkish troops and the sheer exhaustion of the slaughter, retreated to their barracks, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than the noise of the battle. It was the silence of a tomb. The survivors emerged from the cellars and the riverbanks, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes hollow, looking like ghosts wandering through a nightmare. They walked through the ashes of their lives, looking for kin they would never find, for the fire had left no bodies to bury, only dust. The purification was complete. Al-Hakim had cleansed the city of its impurities, its noise, its commerce, its joy, and its people. He had wanted a city worthy of Al-Quddus, and he had created one, a place as barren, silent, and lifeless as the desert itself. The reaction of the Caliph to the devastation he had wrought was the final twist of the knife. He rode down from the hills on the fifth day to inspect the ruins. As his donkey picked its way through the debris, he looked around with an expression of mild confusion, as if he were a tourist visiting a strange land. He asked his vizier why the people had destroyed their own homes. He denied ever giving the order. He wept crocodile tears for the tragedy that had befallen his beloved subjects, blaming the unruly soldiers, blaming the Turks, blaming the alignment of the stars, blaming everyone but the face in the mirror. He ordered the execution of the very commanders he had sent to burn the city, sacrificing his own loyal dogs to appease the anger of the mob, a final act of betrayal that proved no one was safe from his caprice. The people watched him ride by in sullen, terrified silence. They did not cheer, they did not bow. They simply stared with the dead eyes of men who have seen the face of hell and know that the devil rides a grey donkey. The bond between ruler and ruled was severed forever. The fear remained, yes, but the reverence was gone, replaced by a cold, hard hatred that waited in the ashes like a viper. The burning of Fustat was the climax of his tyranny, the moment when the madness spilled over the brim and drowned the world. But as the smoke cleared and the call to prayer rose once more from the surviving minarets, shaking and tentative, a new feeling began to take root in the hearts of the Egyptians. It was the realization that a God who bleeds his people is no God at all, and that if the heavens would not strike him down, then perhaps, just perhaps, the earth would have to swallow him whole. The stage was set for the final act, for the night when the pure one would ride out into the dark and meet the only thing more powerful than his madness, the inevitable consequence of his sins. The city lay in ruins, but the desert was waiting. The wheel of fate turns with a grinding, inexorable slowness, and for the Caliph al-Hakim by Amr Allah, the year of our Lord 1021 was to be the year when the spokes finally shattered. The city of Cairo, scarred by fire and silenced by fear, lay beneath him like a beaten dog, yet the master of Egypt found no peace in his victory. The madness that had driven him to slaughter dogs, imprison women, and burn his own capital had now distilled itself into a strange, melancholic quietude. He walked the marble halls of his palace like a man who has already crossed the threshold of the grave, his eyes fixed on a horizon that no one else could see. The courtiers, those few who had managed to survive his purges, whispered that the Caliph had begun to speak of a great journey, a transcendence that would finally shed the heavy, impure shell of his mortality and allow him to merge fully with the divine light of Al-Quddus. But in the shadows of the harem, a more earthly and ruthless plot was being woven. His sister, the formidable Sit al-Mulk, a woman of iron will who had watched her brother dismantle the empire piece by piece, knew that the survival of the Fatimid dynasty hung by a thread. She saw the madness not as divinity, but as a cancer, and she understood that for the tree to live, the rotten branch must be severed. The air in the palace grew thick with the static of unseen knives, glances were exchanged in the corridors that carried the weight of treason, and the silence of the night was broken only by the scratching of quills signing secret pacts. On the night of the 13th day of February, under a sky that was pitch black and devoid of the moon's comforting gaze, the caliph prepared for his customary vigil. He dressed himself with ritualistic precision, layering 7 heavy woolen robes over his body, garments of rough texture that he wore as a sign of his ascetic detachment from the luxuries of the world. He summoned 2 squires to attend him, but his demeanor was that of a man who intends to travel alone. He mounted his favorite gray donkey, a beast that had become as feared a symbol in Cairo as the executioner's sword, and rode out of the palace gates. The guards at the threshold bowed low, their foreheads touching the cold stone, not knowing that they were watching the living God King for the very last time. The small party moved through the sleeping city, the donkey's hooves clattering echoing against the silent walls of the houses where the women still languished in darkness. They rode towards the Macadam Hills, that desolate, rocky escarpment that looms over Cairo like a judgment seat. The wind began to howl, kicking up devils of dust that danced in the pale light of the stars, carrying with it the chill of the desert winter. As they reached the foothills, the caliph turned to his attendants. His face, illuminated briefly by the torchlight, was calm, stripped of the rage that had defined his reign. He looked at them with those piercing blue eyes and commanded them to hamstring his donkey, a bizarre order that they obeyed with trembling hands. Then, he dismissed them. He told them to return to the city, for he was going forward to meet the terror, a cryptic appointment with the infinite that he must face alone. The squires, terrified to disobey and equally terrified to leave him, watched as the solitary figure wrapped in 7 robes walked away into the darkness, climbing the steep, treacherous paths of the mountain until the night swallowed him whole. The sun rose the next morning over a city that held its breath. The caliph did not return. The noon prayer came and went, and the minbar remained empty. By sunset, a nervous murmur began to ripple through the court. Was this another test? Was he watching from the shadows to see who would celebrate his absence? For 3 agonizing days, the empire sat in a state of suspended animation, paralyzed by the fear that he might burst through the doors at any moment, demanding heads. But he did not come. Finally, the silence became too loud to ignore. Sit al-Mulk, seizing the moment with the cold pragmatism of a queen, ordered the captain of the guard to scour the Macadam Hills. 1,000 soldiers fanned out across the rocky waste, beating the bushes and searching the caves, their shouts echoing in the canyons. They found the donkey first, its carcass already picked at by the vultures, a grim signpost on the road to oblivion. But they did not find the caliph. They climbed higher, to the desolate precipices where the jackals made their dens, and there, near a deep ravine, they found the only testimony to the fate of the man who would be God. It was a sight that froze the blood of the searchers and would baffle historians for 1,000 years. Lying on the ground, neatly arranged as if the body had simply evaporated from within them, were the caliph's 7 woolen robes. They were not discarded, they were buttoned up, fastened from the neck to the hem, retaining the shape of the man who had worn them. But the man was gone. There was no blood, no struggle, no footprints leading away into the sand. However, upon closer inspection, a horrific detail emerged that shattered the illusion of a peaceful ascension. The robes had been slashed through with daggers, violent, jagged tears that pierced all 7 layers of heavy wool. Yet, the buttons remained fastened. It was a physical impossibility, a riddle written in fabric and violence. How could a man be stabbed to death and removed from his clothes without unbuttoning them? Had he been cut out of them like meat from a casing? Or had the purity he sought finally consumed him, dissolving his flesh into the ether, leaving the clothes behind as a mockery of his material existence? The soldiers stood around the empty garments, afraid to touch them, feeling the heavy, oppressive presence of the supernatural. The wind whistled through the slash marks in the wool, a hollow, mournful sound that sounded like the laughter of the desert demons. The news of the discovery, or rather, the non-discovery, swept through Cairo like a fever. The official proclamation was that the caliph had gone into occultation, that he had withdrawn from the world of men to commune with the divine and would return at the end of time to judge the earth. This was the birth of the Druze religion, whose followers to this day believe that Al-Hakim did not die, but ascended, waiting in the celestial realms for the day of judgment. But in the whispered corners of the souks, a darker, more visceral truth was shared. Men spoke of the sister, Sit al-Mulk, and her hired assassins, the black dogs, who had waited in the rocks. They whispered that the caliph had been ambushed, held down, and butchered, his body dismembered and buried in a dung heap to ensure that no shrine could ever be built, his clothes buttoned back up as a final, terrifying puzzle to haunt his followers. The irony was absolute and devastating. The man who had named himself Al-Quddus, the spotless, the pure, the one free from all defect, had met the messiest, most obscure, and most impure end imaginable. He who had sought to be everywhere, to be the all-seeing eye of the state, had become nowhere, a phantom without a grave, a story without an ending. The reign of terror was over. Sit al-Mulk took the reins of power, and slowly, painfully, the city began to breathe again. The ban on women was lifted, and pale, blinking figures emerged from their homes like survivors of a nuclear winter, feeling the sun on their faces for the first time in 7 years. The shoemakers returned to their lasts, crafting slippers for feet that had forgotten how to walk in the streets. The dogs, or what few had survived in hiding, began to bark again in the distance, a sound that was no longer a crime, but a celebration of life's messy vitality. Yet, the shadow of Al-Hakim never truly lifted from the Golden City. For decades, travelers would report seeing a lone figure on the macadam hills, wrapped in wool, looking down at the city he had tried to burn, a ghost trapped between the earth he despised and the heaven that rejected him. The mystery of the buttoned robes remained the ultimate testament to his madness, a shell with nothing inside, a perfect metaphor for a tyrant who sought to replace God with his own ego, only to find that when the ego is stripped away, there is nothing left but the howling wind and the empty dark. The caliph who stole the name of the Almighty had vanished, leaving behind only a scar on history and a question that the desert wind asks every night: what is the price of perfection? The answer, written in the blood of Cairo and the empty robes on the mountain, is a price that no mortal soul can afford to pay.